Welcome to Shadow Sleep Stories. Get comfy, close your eyes, and let the night's tale take you away. We thought we'd found the perfect getaway. 4 college friends, 1 remote cabin, 3 days of disconnecting from the world and reconnecting with each other before graduation scattered us across the country. The Whispering Pines cabin sat on 40 acres of dense forest in northern Michigan, miles from the nearest neighbor and completely off the grid. Looking back, we should have paid more attention to the name. I'm Jake, and I was the one who found the rental listing online. The price was too good to be true for a 4-bedroom cabin with a full kitchen and stone fireplace. The owner, an elderly man named Garrett Mueller, met us at the property on Friday afternoon to hand over the keys and give us a brief tour. "Beautiful place," said my friend Marcus, a pre-med student who'd been looking forward to this trip for months. "How long has it been in your family?" "Built it myself in 1987, Mueller replied, but something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. "Used to come up here with my wife and kids every summer. Haven't used it much since." He trailed off, staring into the forest that surrounded the cabin on 3 sides. "Since what?" asked Sarah, our group's eternal optimist and the reason we'd all stayed friends through 4 years of college stress. "Since they went into the woods and didn't come back." The 4th member of our group, Chris, laughed uncomfortably. "What do you mean, didn't come back?" Mueller turned to look at us, his pale blue eyes filled with something that might have been regret or warning. 23 years ago, my wife took our 2 boys, ages 8 and 10, for a nature walk after dinner. They were experienced hikers, knew these woods better than most park rangers, but they never returned to the cabin. "What happened to them?" Sarah asked softly. "Search and rescue combed every inch of these 40 acres for 2 weeks. State police, volunteer groups, even brought in helicopters with thermal imaging. Never found so much as a footprint after the trail went cold about half a mile into the forest." We stood there in uncomfortable silence, unsure how to respond to such a personal tragedy. Finally, Mueller cleared his throat and handed me the keys. "Just remember," he said, "these woods are older than the cabin, older than the settlements that used to be here, older than the native tribes that considered this area sacred ground. At night, it's best to stay inside. The forest, it gets restless after dark." And with that cryptic warning, he climbed into his old pickup truck and drove away, leaving 4 college seniors alone with a weekend of what we'd hoped would be relaxation and fun. The first day was everything we'd hoped for. We hiked the marked trails, cooked elaborate meals, played board games, and caught up on the personal dramas that had occupied our final semester. As the sun set behind the tall pines, we built a fire in the stone fireplace and settled in for an evening of stories and shared memories. That's when we heard the first whispers. At first, we thought it was just the wind moving through the trees. The cabin was surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush, and the sound of air moving through branches can create all sorts of acoustic illusions. But as we sat quietly listening, the sounds became more distinct. Voices, human voices speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. "Do you guys hear that?" Chris asked, looking toward the large windows that faced the forest. We all nodded, straining to make out words in the susurrant murmur that seemed to come from every direction at once. "Probably just other campers," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. We'd seen no evidence of other people in the area. No cars, no camps, no hiking trails that showed recent use. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, pressing her face against the glass. "I can't see anything. It's too dark." The whispering continued for about 20 minutes, rising and falling in intensity, but never quite becoming intelligible. Then, suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The forest fell silent. Not just quiet, but completely silent. No night birds, no rustling of small animals, no insects. Just an absolute stillness that felt unnatural and oppressive. "Well, that was creepy," Chris said, trying to lighten the mood. "Anyone up for a horror movie to complete the atmosphere?" We laughed nervously and spent the rest of the evening trying to distract ourselves with games and conversation. But the memory of those whispers lingered. And when we finally went to bed around midnight, none of us slept particularly well. The second night was worse. The whispering started earlier this time, just after sunset, and it was closer. Instead of seeming to come from deep in the forest, the voices now sounded like they were just outside the cabin walls, moving around the perimeter in slow circles. We sat huddled in the main room, the fire built up high, trying to convince ourselves there was a rational explanation. Hikers who'd gotten lost, maybe, or some kind of acoustic phenomenon caused by the wind in the terrain. But then came the knocking. 3 soft taps on the front door. Pause. 3 more taps. Pause. 3 more. We looked at each other with wide eyes. The knocking was deliberate, rhythmic, definitely human. "Who's there?" Marcus called out. No response. Just the continued whispers circling the cabin and the periodic knocking. Always 3 taps, always at the front door. "Should we open it?" Sarah whispered. "Hell no," Chris said immediately. "Remember what Mueller said about staying inside at night?" The knocking continued for over an hour. Sometimes it was soft and polite, like a neighbor asking to borrow a cup of sugar. Other times it was more insistent, demanding. But it never stopped following the same pattern. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. Around 2 a.m., I made the mistake of looking out the front window. There was someone standing at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the darkness. A figure in what looked like hiking clothes, perfectly still, facing the cabin. As I watched, 2 more figures emerged from the forest and took positions on either side of the first one. "Guys," I said quietly, "there are people out there." They joined me at the window, and we all saw them. 3 figures standing motionless at the forest's edge. Too far away to make out details, but close enough to be unmistakably human. "Maybe they're lost," Sarah said. "Maybe they need help." "Then why don't they come to the door and ask for help properly?" Marcus pointed out. "Why just stand there?" As if responding to his question, the 3 figures began walking toward the cabin. Their movement was strange, synchronized, like they were marching in formation. As they got closer, I could see that they were wearing outdated clothing, the kind of hiking gear you might see in photographs from the 1980s. The knocking at the door became more insistent, matching the rhythm of their approach. "We should call for help," Chris said, reaching for his phone. But like the rest of us, he had no signal. The cabin was too remote, too isolated. The figures stopped about 20 feet from the front porch, and that's when I got my first clear look at them. It was a woman and 2 children, a family that matched Mueller's description of his wife and sons. But something was wrong with their faces. They were too pale, too gaunt, and their eyes reflected light like an animal's eyes in the darkness. The woman raised her hand and pointed directly at me through the window. Her mouth moved, and I could hear her voice clearly despite the glass and distance. "Let us in. We're so cold. We've been walking in the woods for so long." The 2 boys flanked their mother, and they too began speaking. "We can't find our way home. The forest is so dark. Please help us. Let us in." Their voices joined the whispers that surrounded the cabin, creating a chorus of pleading that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. "Those are Mueller's family," I whispered. "The ones who disappeared." "That's impossible," Marcus said. "That was 23 years ago. Those kids would be adults now." But even as he spoke, I could see the recognition in his eyes. The family standing outside our cabin matched the description Mueller had given us perfectly. "We have to help them," Sarah said, moving toward the door. "No!" Chris grabbed her arm. "Something's wrong. Look at their eyes. Look at how they're standing." He was right. The 3 figures stood unnaturally still, like mannequins posed to look human. And their eyes held no warmth, no life. Just a hungry emptiness that made my skin crawl. The knocking at the door became frantic, desperate. The whispers from the forest grew louder, more insistent, and through it all, the family continued their pleading. "Please, we just want to come inside. We've been lost for so long. The cabin is warm. We can see the fire. Let us in." I realized with growing horror that they weren't asking for help. They were asking for something else entirely. The way they stared at the cabin, the hunger in their voices, the mechanical repetition of their pleas, they didn't want to be rescued. They wanted to replace us. "We need to leave," I said. "Now." "We can't," Marcus pointed out. "They're blocking the path to the car." It was true. More figures had emerged from the forest, dozens of them, all wearing outdated clothing, all with the same pale, gaunt faces and hungry eyes. They formed a semicircle around the cabin, trapping us inside. And I began to understand what Mueller had really been warning us about. The forest wasn't just restless at night. It was hungry. It collected visitors who ventured too deep into the woods, kept them wandering in the darkness until they forgot who they were and why they'd come. And once it had claimed them, it used them to lure others. The Whispering Pines cabin wasn't a vacation rental. It was bait. The knocking at the door became thunderous, violent. The windows rattled in their frames. The whispers from the forest rose to a roar of desperate voices, all pleading, demanding, commanding us to open the door. "Let us in. We just want to come home. The fire is so warm. Please." But we didn't open the door. We huddled together in the center of the main room, surrounded by the sounds of the forest's collected victims, and waited for dawn. The sun rose at 6:23 a.m., and with the first rays of light, the knocking stopped. The whispers faded. The figures outside melted back into the forest like mist. We packed our belongings in silence and left the cabin within an hour, driving away without looking back. 3 months later, I received a phone call from a detective in Michigan. Garrett Mueller had been found dead in his home, apparently of natural causes. In going through his belongings, they discovered a storage unit filled with personal effects from families who had rented the cabin over the years, families who had never returned home. The detective wanted to know if we'd experienced anything unusual during our stay at Whispering Pines. I told him we'd had a wonderful, peaceful weekend and that Mr. Mueller had been a gracious host. Some truths are too terrible to share, and some places are too hungry to ever truly let their visitors go. Even now, months later, and hundreds of miles away, I sometimes hear whispers in the wind, and late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I swear I can hear soft knocking at my door. 3 knocks, pause. 3 knocks, pause. They're still out there, in that forest, waiting for the next group of friends looking for the perfect weekend getaway. And someday, I'm afraid, they might decide to come looking for us.